Welcome to Raising the Bar with RebuttalPR, the podcast where we elevate the stories of the plaintiff's bar and dive into the key trends shaping the civil justice system today. I'm your host, Ray DeLorenzi, and in each episode, we'll bring you insightful interviews with leading attorneys, expert perspectives on current legal events, and in-depth discussions on the issues that matter most. Now let's jump in.
I don't look at anybody in terms of what they look like or who they are. We are all created equal, and our Pledge of Allegiance says that it's liberty and justice for all and not for some. So as nervous and anxious as I was when I walked in that room, within about 5 or 10 minutes, I was with family.
Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of Raising the Bar with RebuttalPR. I'm your host, Ray DeLorenzi, and today I'm honored to be joined by Tony Romanucci of Romanucci and Blandin in Chicago. For those who are not familiar with Tony, and I cannot understand why you aren't familiar with Tony, he is, I believe, one of the leading civil rights litigators of our time. He has a very varied practice in terms of the personal injury work he does, but of late, and unfortunately of late, has become very well known for taking on really cutting edge, important for society civil rights work. So with that, Tony, welcome to the podcast. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Ray, so much. I know we've known each other for a while, and I'm really honored to be on your podcast.
So, Tony, let's kick it off with you as a first generation Italian American. I'm an Italian American as well, second generation, however. Tell me about growing up as that first generation in the United States and how you got interested in the law in the first place.
Well, I think what people don't know about me, like if you were to ask me, Tony, tell me a fun fact about you. Well, first of all, I have a lot of fun facts, but you don't have enough time for that. But if I'm going to go back to fun fact how about little Tony, when Tony was just a little boy, I was probably almost 4 years old before I started speaking English. And, that's because, my parents, came from Italy. My mother was born and raised in Italy. My father lived there for 18 years before he came to the United States. So he was here a little bit before my mother. But you got to figure, my father was working during the day. My mother was home with me. And guess what language I spoke? Not English, only Italian. And so I was, this 3-year-old running around speaking Italian to everybody, and they didn't know what the hell I was saying. So my father found a school for me where Sister Michela was the nun, and she was an Italian-speaking nun. And so she transitioned me to an English-speaking little Tony. And that's when I say my career began, right? When I started speaking, the common language here in our country. And, that from there, I spent all my years through high school in Catholic schools with nuns and priests and, lay teachers. And I went on to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, which is where I really think I got my education, Ray, and my background, where I feel like I began to understand what it meant to have civil rights, what it meant to be, a person who lives in a free society, where, I started growing up.
What was your, I guess, first sort of notion that I want to be a lawyer? And what was a lawyer? Was it, TV shows as a kid? Were you ever around other lawyers? What was sort of that, seminal moment where you're like, this is a career path for me?
Well, I wasn't around many lawyers growing up. There was one neighbor of ours growing up where he was a lawyer. So, that was interesting, but I can't say that he was the motivation for me being an attorney. Really, the motivation and the moving force in my life for becoming an attorney and going to law school was my father. He made sure that I, went to school, that I graduated from undergrad, and that I went to law school. He knew that I could be a very good professional, and he wanted me to strongly consider law. And, I took his advice. I listened to my father. And I did, and it's the best decision that I ever made. So I give 99% of the credit goes to him for pushing me in that direction. And then it took the 1% for me to say, yes, that's what I want to do.
So, you could be a lawyer, you could do, 100 different things. You can go practice patent law, you could do whatever, whatever you want with that, but you decide at some point you want to represent individuals. And I want to talk about being a public defender in a minute, but where in your career, was it in law school? Was it before that where you're like, I don't want to represent, a company. I want to represent people.
Well, that's a really good question because when I was in law school, I was convinced. There was no doubt in my mind when I was in law school that I was going to be a securities attorney. I wanted to work for the Securities Exchange Commission in the worst way. I wanted to be a compliance attorney with the SEC. But then I landed on something that I didn't know would really change the whole course of my career. And it's a very good thing that what happened. I know you wanted to save the public defender, but I met somebody who said, "Hey, if you're interested in working for the summer for the Cook County Public Defender, I think I can help you out." And not only did that person help me out, but he was the hiring person for the Cook County Public Defender. And I did. I got hired for the PD's office, and that changed my career.
So being a public defender is a far cry from working at the SEC or doing securities work. Why'd you say yes to that opportunity?
Well, it was interesting to me. It was something that sounded very interesting. I knew that I liked the courtroom because by that time I had already gone through my moot court in law school and I had, participated in a courtroom mock trials. So that I knew that I liked the courtroom. And so when I was told that I could be stationed in a courtroom, for the summer, I thought, all right, well, this sounds pretty fun. This sounds like something that I should experience. And I took the job for the summer. It was a non-paying job, actually. It was a clerkship. But then by the time the summer ended and it was time for me to complete my tour, I wanted to stay on. So I begged them to keep me on, and they did. While I finished my 3L, my third year of law school, and then after that it was game over. I never looked back.
So the public defender, I mean, not only are you representing people who have been accused of doing something, whether it's on the mild end or the very severe end of a criminal offense, but also they have no resources typically, and that's why they need a public defender. How did that shape your view of both the criminal justice system and also just humanity generally?
Yeah. Well, what I found out very early on, I mean, I'm sure your listeners have a very good, if they can, close their eyes for a second and imagine, Lady Justice, holding those scales. And, she has a blindfold on and she's holding scales in one hand and a sword in the other with the snake at her feet. And that sword is used to ward off evil, which, not only in biblical times, but also modern times has a significance of evil. And I learned that those scales that are supposed to be evenly scaled and blind, well, they weren't. They were not evenly scaled for people who were poor or who were demographically, they were living in challenged neighborhoods, or if you were poor. So if you were black, brown, poor, and lived in one of the challenging neighborhoods in Chicago of the West Side or the South Side, scales weren't tipped in your favor. The odds were way against you. The police and even the prosecutors, they all had everything. It was a lot of it was already cooked before anybody even got to court. A lot of those cases were already rigged when it came to them, whether they were in possession of guns or whether they had guns in the vicinity of them, because I worked in gun court, so I had a lot of experience with guns and drugs when I was a young lawyer. So I became very familiar and learned and schooled in the Fourth Amendment, and I saw that a lot of the narratives, what we now call our cover stories, it was the same story over and over again about how this particular individual was arrested and then eventually very likely convicted of gun possession. And so I saw that story so many times that I learned very well how to challenge those stories and how to win them. And I'm still doing it today.
I'm sure being invested, personally in any of these cases, a public defender is probably not a good situation to be in because of how difficult the work is. But I'm curious if there's one that stands out in your time there where it just told you this system is completely busted. And, is there something that stands out in that regard to you?
Well, here's what stands out in that regard, Ray. I used to, you have to imagine, I'd come to work in the morning when I was working at 11th and State Street here in gun court, and I would have to interview anywhere from 20 to 50 overnight arrests. And I'd have to go into the holding pen with them, and the guard would open up the door, and just like you would see in a movie, he'd open it up, clank, clank. He'd shut the door, click, click, clank, clank. He'd lock it, and there I'd be with all the overnight arrests. And up and down, I'd have to interview them and hear almost the same story. And so it wasn't really one case, but when you think of the magnanimity of it all, of thousands, when you put it together, it does become one story then. And that's how I learned that the odds were stacked against certain people, not only in terms of what would happen to them, but also credibility. Now, can you imagine right now in this day saying that, oh, if you're black, you're less credible than if you were white? I mean, you would be condemned. You would be condemned. You would be canceled. You'd be out of it. But that's how it used to be. That's how it used to be. If you were black and poor or brown and the same or didn't speak English, ah, you're less credible. The word of the police officer, 98% of the time, won the day. And now, with the advent of cell phones and cameras, which are ubiquitous, now we know, oh, they're not right 98% of the time. Maybe it's 90%. Maybe it's 85%. Maybe some people think it's 50%, but it ain't 98%. I'll tell you that.
Let's fast forward to when you decided to start Romanucci and Blandin in 1998. Um, what did you have in mind for the type of firm you wanted to build?
Well, what I knew that I wanted to do was handle only individual cases. I just wanted to represent plaintiffs, which was a tough decision when we started, R&B because, Stefan and I didn't have that much. I mean, we didn't have that many cases. And so we didn't know how we were going to eat month to month. I mean, we both had families, we had a little bit of money saved. We had a very, very, very small office with a few employees. And it was challenging at first. But, we found out that we decided that we would do one thing and one thing only. And that's what's true still today. Our mission is to take care of the client first. Hard stop, period. If anybody in our firm, and they all know this, every employee knows this, if they do not put the best interests of our clients first, take care of our client first, you don't belong here. It's just not a place for you to work. There are other places that you can work, and I freely tell people that. And that's why people work here, because they know they have to take care of them first. You never, ever put your own personal interest or money interest ahead of clients, ever. That doesn't belong anywhere. So that's the kind of firm that we wanted to build, where we could take care of the client.
Is there a moment in the early days of the firm, you said you're building it, didn't have a ton of resources, but there was a case where you're like, we made it. We're on the map now. This can work.
Yes, that did happen. It did happen. It was about 2 years in. We were about 2 years into the firm, or maybe even a little bit earlier. I think it was within a year, actually. And there was a horrific, terrible, awful accident that happened at a suburban grocery store where an 82-year-old woman, she was literally in the produce department picking bananas off the counter. But what she didn't know, what was going on overhead on the roof of this grocery store, was that they were replacing the roof. and they had stacked all the roofing materials in one location. Rather than spreading them out and spreading the weight over the roof, they stacked them all in one location, and this location happened to be over the banana counter. And so Rose Dominic was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and the roof came crashing down on her. Over 50,000 pounds of material came crashing on her. But somehow, miraculously, this banana counter saved her life because it fell on top of her, leaving a gap. Her life was spared. Her life was spared, but she was the first client that I represented that I say had injuries from A to Z, where that if you had a list of A to Z that went vertically, you could put an injury next to every letter of the alphabet. It was a widely publicized case. It was in the news for quite a while, not only because of her age, but because of she survived and because of the egregious conduct of the contractors. And we settled it eventually a couple years later for a record amount for an octogenarian, and that's when we hit it. That's when we pressed go.
So, you're a lawyer, that today is more of a rare breed where, you, of course, are known for very large settlements, not just in monetary value, but in societal value, but also you can try a case. And, let's take that case or any other case. What's the decision matrix where you're like, you know what, we're going to go the distance on this? Or, this one, resolving it before that makes the most sense. How do you and the firm actually, approach those decisions?
Well, certainly, and I'm going through that decision matrix right now so that you're seeing it happen in real time because I'm starting trial 2 weeks from today, and our decision matrix happened, months and months ago where we said, "We're trying this case. Period. Don't talk to me about anything else except trial." Sometimes I don't know what the feeling is, Ray, but sometimes you get a sense that this is the case you try. It's the one where liability is a little bit more challenging, but the damages are catastrophic. And you think that the defendant either isn't taking the case seriously or not going to do what's right. And so I just kind of shut it down. I just kind of shut that part of it down and I only focus on trial. And that's what we're doing on this one. Because I know if we're successful on it, if we're successful for our client, we'll do very well for him. Now, I hope it doesn't go the other way, but those are the risks that we will take.
So I want to fast forward, the case you just talked about, which is about, I guess, the year 2000. Um, and move towards talking about George Floyd, which, I don't know if you view this differently, but it was certainly the case where I think from a national standpoint, Romanucci and Blandin, reached another level. Um, I want to walk through that. If you can recall, when you got the phone call, and I'm not sure if it was from, and also you worked with Ben Crump on that, how that all came to be involved in a case with such huge weight and importance.
Well, I can tell you exactly where I was when I got that call. It was like one of those moments, like, where were you, when the planes hit the towers? It was that kind of moment. And I was actually, it was, we were deep into COVID at that time. And I remember that I was really, really burning it at both ends of the candle when it came to work because I was president of Illinois Trial Lawyers Association. I was running the law firm. I was also chairman of the Illinois Supreme Court Rules Committee. And between those three, trying to figure out how to navigate COVID with all of the activities that we had going on in those three organizations was a lot of work. And so by the end of May, I told Andrea, I said, we need a break. I said, let's get down to Florida. We have a place there. And we were relaxing for the first couple of days. And it was that Tuesday. So it would have been May 26th of the year 2000. I was sitting at my kitchen counter having my morning coffee, reading the news. And I get a text message from a really good friend of mine in Ohio. And he says, Tony, have you seen this? I click on the link, I open it up, and I see that cell phone video that Darnella took of the event. And I'm like, oh my God. I literally, I was gasping. looking at it. And I wrote him back and I said, no, have not seen this. I said, my God, this is the biggest civil rights case in the world. That's what I said. And he wrote back and he says, Tony, Godspeed. I hope you get the case. And that was it for about 3 hours. And then I got a phone call from Ben, and he says, Tony, are you ready? We got a call from the Floyd family. We're on. And that's when it started. So one day after George was murdered, and we can say he was murdered because there's a conviction that says that, we got involved in the case, and that's when we pressed on the gas and we didn't let up for a full year until we got accountability across the board, except for one specific area, and that's federal legislation.
Curious how you got to know Ben Crump and how you built a rapport and trust with him
Yeah.
where you are the one that he calls in for these types of cases in many instances.
I'm so glad you asked that because I love sharing how Ben and I met. Back in 2014 or 15, I tried a case in the Middle District of Florida, which is known to be a highly, very conservative area of Florida. And I took on a police shooting case against the Marion County Sheriff's Department. And people told me, you're nuts. What are you doing? You're trying a case where it's almost impossible to win. Everybody is pro police there. And Ray, that's the case where we made the decision to try the case. It was, one or two attempts at settlement, and they weren't serious about it. And we said, forget it. We're done. We're taking that off the table. We're pressing down, and we're going to try this case. And we did. And we set a record in the Middle District of Florida, which I think still stands today, for that verdict. And because it was a Section 1983 case, we were entitled to what's called Section 1988 fees. We were going to petition for our attorney fees on top of the judgment. And so I needed somebody to vouch for me. I needed somebody to give me some credibility that my work down there was worthwhile. And so Ben, at that same time, had just finished up the Trayvon Martin case. Well, I didn't know this man, but I knew that he did great work with what he did for Trayvon Martin and his family. So I cold called Ben Crump and I asked him, hey, would you mind reviewing the work that I did and offering a petition verifying that my work was customary and that my hourly rate is something that would be awarded in this district? And I think he was impressed that we were able, number one, to get a verdict, and number two, get a record verdict where it's not possible. And from there, we became friends, and the rest is really history between us. He is my brother.
Tell me about meeting the Floyd family for the first time and, whether, obviously a family in grief, and unfortunately you have to do a lot of that as part of your work. What what was that? And again, I assume that's another moment in that case that you'll, never forget.
I won't ever forget. I remember walking into the room, and I got to give you a little background too, because I don't get nervous in front of people. I don't feel that anxiety when I meet people generally. I have a fairly outgoing personality. People tend to like me when they meet me, and but I was nervous. I was anxious. I felt all those things that I just told you that I am not, because I knew, first of all, the weight of the world was on our shoulders for this case. Everybody was, excuse me, everybody was watching, and I was nervous. And I'll tell you, I walked into a room, I was the only white person in the room, and I didn't know how they would accept that. But you know what? They did. They 100% accepted me as somebody who was equal. And that's what's so important with what I do. I don't look at anybody in terms of what they look like or who they are. We are all created equal. And our Pledge of Allegiance says that it's liberty and justice for all and not for some. So as nervous and anxious as I was when I walked in that room, within about 5 or 10 minutes, I was with family.
So that case, there was a $27 million settlement, but you very much in line with that settlement said, we're not done here. There's more work for us to do um, in terms of pushing for systemic change. How do you decide in any case you take on, and also in conjunction with the family, you know, what is that next step and how do you sort of coordinate that to work with them and say, look, a verdict or settlement, of course, is your obligation to them, but also where you see an opportunity to take things to the next level?
Well, first of all, you got to look at the case. Look at the totality of the case. Does the particular event which brought the case into the office lend itself to any other type of assistance that's needed that can help the community? Is there any other prongs of justice that we can pursue that would help the community? And so clearly with George's case, the answer was a definitive and unequivocal yes. What Derek Chauvin did, his neck restraint was not only a neck restraint, but it was more specific. It was a carotid artery restraint. He compressed the very artery that feeds our brain the blood that's necessary for it to work. And so by doing that, we knew that we had to change the system. And so that's what we did. And not only did we do it in Minnesota, but it happened in a lot of other states. Not that we went to every state to make those legislative changes, but because, especially, this is where Ben is so great, because of his national voice and his desire for justice, we were able to convince so many other state legislators that they needed to make the change to ban this type of neck restraint, which we know causes death.
I know you and Ben and the Floyd family had pushed for the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which, like a lot of things, died in Congress. And I read a quote um, from you, and I believe this was in a 2002 speech that you gave, where, in short, what you said was you hoped it didn't happen, but it was going to take another George Floyd for there to be real policing reform. And um, do you still believe that's the case? Are you at all hopeful that that is there's an opportunity there at some point in the future?
Well, I will always remain optimistic that there's an opportunity, but I will tell you, it's like you have to stay healthy, and make sure that you're going to live a long time in order to see the change, because these wheels are going to turn very slowly and they go backwards for a long time, and they're super rusty, and it's going to take some time. Not that I'm trying to jump ahead of you, but when you look at what's happened in our country with, ICE and CBP and DHS and our representation of Renee Good. Well, I mean, is it easy for me to say that, well, Renee Good is another, George Floyd moment? Well, you can say that, but nobody's taking the opportunity to say, oh, let's make some national change. No, Congress is sitting on its hands waiting for this to keep happening and let people die needlessly. And that's what's really frustrating and causes a lot of anxiety to me, is that that things should change, but they don't.
So that's a good segue into what I want to discuss next. Minneapolis is a second home to me, so a place I care about and love deeply. And as you mentioned, you represent the family of Renee Good, who was killed in Minneapolis. And you have, versus you being up against city police forces, city police. Here we have a federal agent, essentially, who they claim they have, near absolute immunity, if not total absolute immunity. What's your approach to that sort of case compared to the prior work you've done? Again, in a moment when there is, it's sort of a tinderbox, although I guess many could say that I guess there's probably more public support on your side now than there was during the George Floyd era.
Well, I don't think there's, I agree with you. Okay. I think there's a lot more public support now for what we're seeing happening in our country as opposed to George Floyd, because right now, what we're seeing and what we saw was an occupation of American cities by our own government. This is a free country. Last time that I read the Constitution, and a lot of people are very upset at how this administration is handling our own American cities by occupying them with armed forces. So yes, we do have public support on our side, but still, when a case of this magnitude, and when I say magnitude, Renee's death was needless, senseless. It's there should be no death that should go unaccounted for. But because of the public limelight and spotlight this case had, we knew you can't treat this case like we did any other. We promised inside this office we're going to throw out the playbook on how we handle cases. We're going to create a new one for Renee, and we did. And for that entire family, we promised them a whole bunch of things, and a lot of them we've been able to keep so far. A lot of them we haven't yet because we're not there yet. Okay, but we will be. But we knew that when we're going up against the institution of not only our government, but the president and the Secretary of Homeland Security and the director of the FBI and the Attorney General, who are all piling on, calling people words that they should not be, that we are doing something that is different. And so we have to handle it differently. And we did. And we've been very successful so far in shaping public opinion, I believe, in the favor of Renee.
So, I'm in the PR and communications business, and you're a lawyer who, um, to pat her on the back, you have a communications director internally, which many firms do not have, who does a tremendous job. And I'm curious how, in cases like this or any case, you view the media as a tool for accomplishing your advocacy on behalf of the family. How do you think about that, and what is the best way to, again, use that tool as you would as any other tool in your toolbox, one that it makes sense to use it sometimes, and at other points it doesn't make sense to use it, and there's another tool you need to use?
Yeah, that's excellent because with Renee and with what happened to her, obviously we have a family that we're dealing with, and we have to be respectful and sensitive to their needs first. But we always ask, what is your intention here? What is your goal for us? And depending on where that goes, then we will communicate a plan for them. And so with Renee, our plan was very intentional. It was very deliberate. It was not one where we just said, let's go and have a blowout press conference. That was not this case. And that was, again, a very intentional act on our part to not do that, but rather go step by step and media outlet to media outlet and do individual interviews and have a little bit of a longer time with everybody and teach the moment as opposed to announcing it. So we really took the opportunity to not only teach the moment, but also give our plan for what needed to change in this country so that federal law enforcement officers could be held accountable.
So you have spent a huge chunk of your career holding police officers accountable, police departments accountable. You're now looking to hold the federal government accountable. I'm curious as to, when you're around Chicago, do the police know who you are, and do they appreciate what you do? Do they hold it against you? And now, have you heard from people inside the federal government that uh, you know appreciate what you're doing here? I'm just curious what, as someone who is in the limelight and is known in their community, what sort of that reaction is to what you do.
So Ray, if you were my one person jury right now and I was questioning you before my trial, the one thing that I would tell you is, Mr. DeLorenzi, I want you to know that I'm going to ask you a lot of questions about police officers, but I, for one, appreciate the police. I would be the first one to call the police if I needed them. I am not one who dislikes the police or hates them. I only want to hold the ones that do wrong accountable. Is that something that you can say that you could do in this case if you got the job to be a juror here? So that's my way of saying that I appreciate police officers. I do not dislike them, but the ones that are bad or should not be police officers, I want to hold accountable. And I've got friends who are police officers. I've got a restaurant that we go to here across the street, and he's in there every day, and we give each other a hug. And he damn well he knows what I do because they pretty much know my name. Every police officer in this city probably knows my name. Luckily, I can say for the most part of my career, I've been left alone. But there have been those, insidious moments where, things happen where you wish they didn't. But that is very, very far and few between. And for the most part, I think we have a healthy respect for each other because they know that I mean well with what I do.
Tony, you've been very generous with your time. What I'd like to end with is, and you sort of touched on this before, but you are in the epicenter of, one of the greatest periods of civil unrest that we've had in decades. And what keeps you optimistic that we're all going to come out the other side of this better than the way we came in?
Well, my answer might surprise you a little bit, and that's our young lawyers that are out there today. I get a lot of opportunities and chances to meet young lawyers, and when I do meet them, so many of them, they're so respectful and so kind, and they say, "I love your work, I love what you do, and I respect it," and I thank them, and I say, "That's good, but we need you." I can't do this alone. And so my job, Ray, right now, I feel is to motivate and get and energize the younger generation of lawyers that are out there who want to do the same. And it's just a matter of making sure that they have the right guidance. So what motivates me is really me motivating the younger lawyers and watching them do it. That's what gives me now pleasure in my career is seeing that.
With that, Tony Romanucci with Romanucci and Blandin, thanks so much for joining the podcast today, and please keep up the fight for all of us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Ray. Stay well.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Raising the Bar with Rebuttal PR. Don't forget to subscribe and follow to join us next time. See you then.